the schedule for the next is November we meet. December we're going to just have a little potluck, kind of celebrate the quiet time of the bee season. Going into the new year, of course, January, there's not too much to talk about. Who wants to talk about bees right after the first? We will be looking to start up in February. But before we can get to that, the main point of this evening's gathering is to talk about the leadership of the club. So as everybody hopefully knows, John was leading the club for 2 years. He's had some things come up in his life that sort of have had to take top priority. He has stepped down, not running again for president. I think we've talked about this in a few meetings, but today we are getting to elect the board members. So I wanted all the board members that we have to come up, just because if any of you want our roles, you got to vote us in or volunteer to come up for it. So Brian Christ, I'm the vice president. Does anybody want my role? Does anybody vote me to continue in this role? I get a 1, I get a 2, I am in. Phyllis, I'll let you go around and just introduce and put your role out.
I'm Phyllis Morey, and I'm the treasurer, and I've been in this position since last March. So I'm still kind of a learning. Anybody interested in being treasurer? It's a great job.
Anyone interested in her continuing in that role? Here. Down the line.
Okay. I'm Andrea. I am secretary. I've only been doing this about 2 months now, I think. So, but anybody interested in secretary? Okay.
Anybody want her to continue as secretary? Round of ayes. Ryan?
Hi, I'm Ryan. I am on the board in a loosely defined thing as I'm here to help out with all the tech and all the community stuff, and I've been doing this for I don't know.
Media outreach, I think, is what his official title is.
I didn't get the business card yet.
Yeah, it's in the mail.
I've been doing this for a few months and just getting started. But all the new videos and stuff, that's what I'm trying to work on.
Yeah, so he's leading the, you've probably noticed in the last email, and it's the thing we're really going to try to lean into next year, is being able to do live streaming. Not everyone can come every time we have a meeting. We want to make it a little more available for people who are remote. And not only that, but if you can't even attend this night, you can watch it later. We're trying to build up that video interaction. So that's what Ryan is leading. Is anybody tech genius who wants to take over his role? Does everybody want him to keep working on and making this better? Fantastic. So now we come to the hard part. We have an opening for a president. We don't have anybody currently to fill the president. The role's main responsibility, if it hasn't been described, is fundamentally to keep all the cats going in one direction in terms of what we're doing as a club, and to sort of set the, when we come up with topics that we want to talk about, when we bring in guest speakers, just the general, how are we serving you as a club, and what are we doing to the community? The president's kind of the one who leads that. They don't have to do everything, but it's theirs to kind of set the direction. So it's a big role to fill, and under the bylaws of the club, we have to have it filled to continue with the year. So for all those who showed up today, is anybody hankering to start talking about bees more regularly and maybe giving some direction to how this club goes into next year? Does anybody who knows somebody who didn't show up today want to be president and they just are held up in traffic? So where we're at, if no one can fill that role, by the end of the year, we're going to have to close down this club, just as a general statement. The problem is with the roles we have, we need to have each person assigned to a role. If you have an open thing, it's part of the bylaws. It's a problem. So we'll probably send out some communique to see if anyone wants it. If they do, we'll have to communicate with the club to say, hey, this person's volunteered. We need to at least have one or two people agree. If no one steps up, it does suck, but for the club to function, we have to have a leadership team, and it's got to come from the club to do
How
that.
many meetings do you have?
So the general official structure is we meet, and one of the things that Phyllis has been working on is getting us back on track. Normally, we're supposed to meet the first Thursday of every month, excluding January because we kind of decided that, isn't a great time of year. So we have one official club meeting with everybody. We tend to, as a board, get together about every quarter to talk about, what are we talking about the next quarter? We have different programs that we want to do. Some of these we need to dust off and get a little better on, but we just review, okay, for the next 3 to 6 months, what do we want to do? Past that, the structures that we do on top of that is the enrichment for the club, planning field days. Usually that's got to be somebody who's got an apiary that can support it. Like I've got an apiary that's in my backyard. It's got about this much space behind the hives. It would be horrible to show somebody through it. John had a bigger field. He kind of led with that. Again, that's kind of just planning, how do we engage? We've been talking about and sort of holding off until we got president nominated, but normally the president helps facilitate 1 to 3 classes per year that we offer to the community, usually with a fee to join or to attend, but it's basically introduction to beekeeping, because part of our mission is, most people who come to the club come because they're interested in bees and they're getting started. So a lot of the new members, it is that first year, second year, how do I get started in this? And that's their cycle. So making sure that we're doing a reach out to the community to offer those kind of classes, what content we're showing. A couple years ago it was an 8-hour class with lunch served in the middle. John whittled it down to 3 to 4 hours, and it was more of just, here is the information you're going to need to get started, with a follow-up of, hey, if you want to get some hands-on before you get your bees, he'd do a thing in the apiary. So that's the kind of, in terms of the dedication, that's it. Again, also just, what we talk about this time. Again, for me, I'm kind of filling in that role right now. That's where I came up with, let's talk about winter feeding. And Phyllis has a little bee quandary that she's been talking to me about. I thought it'd be kind of fun to share with the club, just for what we came up with, why we're doing it, and then we can kind of even give some feedback of how our bees go through that experiment. That's what the role is. Again, I would say, just with the show of hands, if you have questions, you can reach out to us. Maybe we need to give a number, or you can respond to the secretary email that sends out the meeting reminders. If you're interested, if you have questions, let us know. We don't have to have it today, but we do have to have somebody fill the role by the end of the year. So it's not just on you, but if you know anybody, if you're interested, if you just, man, I got time to kill, please let us know. We'd love to keep this club going. So any other questions on that? Comments on it? Got 4 in, 1 shy. So saying that we continue into next year, just to review, one thing that we wanted to get your feedback on from a club business perspective is we're going to change locations. Phyllis has arranged for a new permanent location so that we can go to it on the first Thursday of every month. It's a little different format. Would you mind just talking them through where we're at and sort of what's available?
My church has a big room where we can meet. We can meet the first Thursday of the month. It's in Rogers. It's at Old Ridge and 8th Street. It's Peace Lutheran Church. The door, it's easy to get in and get out. There's parking on the back side. And it's available, and we've already got approval to move there. The problem with this facility is sometimes the 4-H and some
Beginning of the year, it's
they have priority, and so maybe we always have it the first Thursday, but they've got something going on, so we've got to move it to another night, and
we kind of lose people in the shuffle.
Lose people in the shuffle is what it is, but this would be a permanent, and it's a permanent.
Yep.
Any
So
questions? Are y'all from Rogers, or are you familiar with Rogers? Or no?
and this would also
Pardon?
Siri will get us there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and
It's easy to find. 8th and Old Ridge.
yeah, and the reason that we're also leaning into, and we would love feedback, just hands down, if you guys have problems, questions, or other things, we love feedback. This is why we want to do the live streaming, is maybe Rogers isn't the best place or location or time for people. We still want them to be able to engage. That's why the live streaming's important. Another initiative that we wanted to kick off next year that we would love some feedback on, mentoring. It has been a challenge for this club. We have a lopsided amount of new beekeepers looking for mentors, and it sort of overwhelms anyone who's interested in being a mentor, because they tend to get 3, 5, 7 people, and everybody has different expectations of what mentoring means. We've had some successes, we've had some challenges. One of the things that we're hoping to do is, starting in February, is to do maybe once a month where we have just, and hopefully everybody's got a computer at home or phone, just a forum that we'd host for an hour by the members here, where you could come in, you could ask questions. Hey, I don't know what I should be doing now. Hey, my bees are doing this. Basically a forum where maybe it's not so much us presenting to you, but if you just want to talk bees, want to talk about what's going on with you, or know what's going on to everybody else, it would be a virtual option so that we could have those kind of dialogues. Because I do like these once a month meetings, but I don't know that you guys get a chance to really talk to each other, because the one thing that is universal is the way I do bees is different than Phyllis, and different than Ryan, and whatever Russell's up to. I can't even keep track of him. Everybody's doing something different, and getting exposed to what the fellow members are doing might fit you better than me just coming up and saying what I think is there. So those are some of the initiatives we're hoping for next year. Again, a president to push that is definitely a big one. I think that is the club business in the summary. So that's it. So I've caught you up on the elections. Again, hopefully we get emails. Ideas of kind of how we want to kick off next year. I have 2 topics I want to talk about tonight, and maybe I'm going to start with what Phyllis and I have been talking about as it's just a fun thing to talk about in terms of, problems that you run into and how you approach it as a beekeeper. But Phyllis has hit me earlier where she has 2 hives, and one of them is she's talking about that top deep is just solid with honey. It's just booming hive, doing great. In fact, she's like, how do I deal with this much honey come spring? Second hive, she's had the reverse problem. So it's not thriving, population's dropping. She's started having problems with moths and even beetles. She's had to reduce down to a single deep. And at the moment, they're all kind of in the middle with empty frames on the edge. And she's like, what can we do about trying to see if this hive dead? Is there anything we can do to save? So I wanted to share what I came up with, a similar scenario, because I found this having a little ingenuity as a beekeeper is fun. But it was about 2 years ago. I was wandering around checking my bee yard one morning when on the side of my house, it looked like somebody had thrown a mud ball at my house. I was kind of mad. I got kids. It happens. I was like, I'm going to go knock that off, and I go check it, and it is a swarm of bees, about yay big. In case you don't know, it is not uncommon for in late or early fall to get fall swarms. They're almost inevitably going to die because they're small. No idea what kind of queen you have. It's really just how much effort do you really want to do? So being a dumb beekeeper, what do you do with bees? You put them in a box. I spent a weekend. I had been working on building some long hives, so I had some scrapped wood. And so for a idea, if you had late swarms, if you have a hive that you've needed to reduce down and you're wondering how you're going to get it through winter, or just you've got nukes that you never merged in and you want to do, this was a box that I put together. And the idea behind it was taking the thick 2x12s. So you've got the super thick insulation. Because you've got a small hive, I looked at doing research. Most nukes are about 5 frames. But when it's winter, they're not producing babies and you need them to be able to fill the most. 4 frames seem to be the best laydown. Built this box. It is literally just straight edges nailed together, generally the shape of. I built in some space for a emergency feed. That's the second part that I want to talk about, but it's just enough space here at the top. And then I built just the normal beekeeping stuff that you throw on top of an inner lid, a little feeder box if you need. And then if you haven't gotten to this, the best part of building something like this for an emergency I got to get through, if you have hives that die, or you have hives that get through winter and they didn't eat all their food, one of the best things you can do is have a little spare freezer, pull those solid frames of honey and put them aside. What we're going to try to do in this combination is I brought 3 frames for her, 2 of these solid honey frames. So this is probably about, it feels like about 5, 6, 8 pounds. It's pretty solid. We're going to do the traditional layout of putting those on the side, and then with the hive she's got, if she has any amount of brood that are being developed, we're going to put them in the middle. Just 4 frames. Super simple. Bees in the middle, honey on the side. This is kind of our experiment. We want to see if they get through. And this may be a great thing. Has anybody ever done anything like this? That you might give Phyllis some advice on what else she could do that would help her bees get through winter without taking any bees from her existing hive, because I think that's a bad idea this time of year.
What's the deal on the internet? And they had the same problem like that right there.
Yeah.
In the 5-frame box, they cut a hole in the bottom of it.
Yep.
Put a double screen board on top of their big hive.
Yep.
And set it right over so the heat could come up through.
Generate it that way.
And yes, that way the 5-frame didn't freeze.
That's not a bad idea.
They stocked it with just like you would, but they put the honey in there, more honey than normal, and it was just jam packed full of bees in the spring.
So if you've got a small hive, and if you have, are those is that the Snellgrove boards that are like that?
This one he had was a 10-frame board with strips in it. He's actually running. He had 6 nukes that he had trouble with. So
Yeah.
6, 7 once sitting on top of a 10-frame.
That was nice and solid.
A single 10-frame, and there was enough heat in there to keep them going as well. As long as you kept them separated where they couldn't touch one another.
Yeah, that's the double screen so they can't reach across.
Can I cut a hole in your board? Your box?
Again, this is just probably. It's not that sturdy. But that's not a bad idea. Have you ever had a chance to try that, or just on the internet?
everything I'm gonna try is, I was gonna try to just do the singles and the 10 frame on top of the single. I haven't had to. The only reason I watched that video was I've got some ideas of stuff I wanna do, but I was wondering how I take them through the winter in the 5 frame boxes. And he uses the 10 frames that he has sitting there and makes
The holes and puts it on top. No, I like that. I mean, that could fit really well for what you've got. Are you running 8 or 10 frame? Okay. So you've got an option of real thick and see what they can do. But with this method, you put them on top and you'd let that big hive heat them up so you have less concerns about them freezing.
And leave the one box with the honey in it.
So
Get out.
Yeah,
Leave
like
it
on
there.
your,
So I've got my brood on the bottom, and then I've got a thing of honey, and then put the other one on the top.
you know,
but you have a double screen in between them so that they can't get to each other, but the heat will raise up and come into them.
it's like a piece of 3/4 inch with that mesh wire on both sides. You put that in there where your top board is right now.
Okay.
Then you set your hive on top of that has a hole in it. And then on top of his hive, you have to put boards on each side, kind of make the ship roof, right? And then on top of his, he had 2 pieces of a 1/2 inch styrofoam on top of a nuke box to keep the heat at the top and one vent hole at the top, just on a sliding board so that the heat come up and went right out, and the insulation held the heat in. And then he wrapped them, and that's how he went through the winter. He said it was, most of the time he would take all of his 5 frame nukes through the winter like that, and come spring, he lives in Maine. Come spring, he would still have a frame and a half of honey left in the nukes.
So Phyllis, you get the equipment. We want to get updates on what you do and how they come out.
Okay.
But
We'll work on that.
I do like that.
The guy's name is David Burns. Watch some of his videos on the nukes.
He's a good one.
Well,
Yeah, he's I was going to reference him. If you haven't heard David Burns, he's a really strong YouTube personality that talks about bees. One of the things that he really focuses on is feeding bees and just how much that plays into it, which leads to the second thing I want to talk about tonight. And again, I kind of want to just bring everybody in on this. It's November. Theoretically, it's supposed to be cold. It's not. I don't know what's going on. But normally this time of year, your most important thing to be doing is you have more time now than past years, but getting ready for winter, removing queen excluders, whatever your winterizing prep plan is. But probably the most important is, do your bees have enough food to get through winter? And maybe just say a general ask to the class, has everybody been checking their hives, going in and kind of doing the old heft test to see if you've got heavy hives, do you have light hives? How's everybody looking?
Mine had very little honey at all this summer. I had no honey going in.
No honey?
I had one hive or 5 that will probably have enough honey to get through the winter. I'm feeding them, yeah.
So you're doing the simple syrup?
I'm doing sugar boards.
Okay. Yeah, the thing that David Burns talks about this a lot too. It's a thing to think about. But there's the first easiest method for feeding your bees to get them to wait is sugar, simple syrup. And the big question is, are you going to do 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 when you feed your bees? So if for the David Burns, he has an entire philosophy that leading up to now, and again, as long as the temperatures stay at the 65, 68, like this is still kind of an option, he recommends the 1-to-1. He also throws in the Honeybee Healthy and a little bit of the pollen substitute for protein. But his theory is it's not the food that you have the biggest problem with, it's the number of bees. And so the lighter syrup helps do brood production, get your bees up. They're going to be able to save anything else they have. It's November. Maybe it's not the way to go, but he recommends that. Usually the best time to start that is September. Like if your hives are underweight, September is a good time to start. If you've got light hives, doing the 2-to-1 is what a lot of the older times would say. That has more sugar per sip. There's less to dry out. It's more quick to turn into actual honey. Your runway for using this kind of goes away once it starts being 50 degrees during the day. There's a certain temperature that the bees just won't be able to draw down the sugar water. Hopefully that's coming sometime soon, but you never know. So what I wanted to talk about is for those people with light hives, or even people who maybe have noticed that once a year we have a week of sub-freezing temperatures that just blows everything away. There's a couple different feeding methods, and I wanted to just talk about them. And I actually want to know who uses them, because going online and reading about it when you talk about somebody doing something in Maine is great, but Arkansas is completely different. So our biggest challenge, in my opinion, is this weather. There's nothing blooming, but it's warm enough for them to fly. So bees tend to go through honey in a different manner than was traditional when you read about, hey, you got to get all this honey and they're just going to sit in the hive and stay. I haven't really seen that. What I have tend to seen is my bees will, any day that it gets to 55 to 60, they're coming out en masse. They're going to start looking for stuff. There's nothing to find, so you just have a ton of bees milling about, and they tend to go through food a lot faster then. What one of the methods that David Burns talks about a lot and makes available, but you can find these online, is the candy boards. And this is literally where you're taking, some people get the really short supers or even a top frame, and it's just, you can find the recipes online. You're basically making really hard sugar brick that will fill it, harden, and then you set that straight on top of the bees. And the idea is that that's going to come up. That's food over their head. They can come clean at any time. What it doesn't do exceptionally well is absorb moisture, which is another problem you're going to fight with. David Burns, if you want to know a lot about that, he makes them, he sells them. I think every video he mentions this board that you can get. It's worth looking at because it's a single piece of equipment that you can put on your hive. You make one, you're able to put it on, but it is additional equipment that you've got to have. You can change this up a little bit. I kind of throw sugar bricks and fondant into a similar category. It's the idea of making, again, the recipes that you can find, and I would recommend if you want to make emergency feed, make it before you need it. Figure out what you want. But the idea is that you're going to get small bricks of homemade fondant or really hard sugar. You're going to create a spacer, which is actually right now, I was mentioning in this board, it's set in. I can actually visualize it a little better by putting in a frame. But basically what you want to do is set up a spacer so that at the top of your hive, there's a gap. And then you are able to take, I've got little silicone molds that I put my homemade fondant in that are about yay big. And then I can just sort of stack this on top, and then I can put boards on top, the regular covers and whatnot. And basically what happens is the natural bee progression is they're going to eat all the honey they have here, and over the winter they start moving up. If they ever get that super cold, you're fine. No matter what, they're going to have sugar over the top. I like this method a lot, particularly with the fondant, because it doesn't do great at absorbing moisture either, but it is a wet sugar that, as my bees are looking for something to do because it's warm, I found they will clean that out before they really start working on their honey. So if you're kind of light and you want to make sure that that honey is there for when they really need it, it's not the worst idea to think about maybe putting in some preemptive methods on top of that. There is also, and I want to know if anybody has done this, but have you heard of the, the mountain sugar method for doing bees, for emergency feed? Have you ever done it?
Yeah, and I make a sugar board that will fit right on top
Yeah.
of a 10-frame box. And it's got a screen on the bottom. It's 1/4 inch so the bees can go through it.
Okay. And then
Just put that on there, and I put a pipe in the middle so there's no sugar around, and then the hole where there's no sugar.
they can come right
Come
up.
up through there, or they can go right through that screen.
Yep. And
It holds 16 pounds of sugar,
yeah.
and that will last all year.
And so you just, I mean, what I've heard is that you put a newspaper, you pour a whole bunch of dry sugar on it, you mix it.
16 pounds of sugar and 2 cups
So-
of water.
Is this a candy board or is this the mountain?
I call it sugar board candy board.
Yeah, candy board's what we were talking about. Or other the other method that I've heard that a lot of people like, I think it's called mountain. Yeah, it is where you, as a moisture and food solution, as opposed to putting like a fondant or something like that, you put a newspaper up top, and then you pour sugar on it. And the idea is the bees will, as moisture is made, it's going to rain down on the sugar, and then when you have wet sugar, that's a food that they can eat. So you're absorbing your moisture and you're making the food. Looking into that, a lot of people like it because it's relatively easy. It's just newspaper and pouring sugar. There's none of this mixing and everything else. I was interested in anybody who's done it because the main downside that I've been hearing about it is the weather we have. If it's warm and they start, I'm cleaning the hive, they go find this paper and they're like, hey, I don't want this. They'll start ripping it out and go. I've heard a lot of people talk about it. I've not seen too many people who've done it. So tell me about your experiences.
So my first year as a beekeeper, I tried that. The people at this club actually recommended or talked to it, so I was like, oh, I'll try that. And yeah, it was basically what you said. I put a newspaper down over my beak. I put a couple slits in it, and then just put like a little pile of sugar on it, not like a little pile, but a sizable amount. And then I don't have a nice shim for it, so I just put another super on top empty and close it up. And I will say that when I came back out later, like they hadn't eaten a lot, but it was fine. But I've had that every year. They don't eat a lot of whatever I give them, but it was fine.
They didn't.
They had chewed up some of the paper, but it was. I wouldn't say it was. Bees were fine, but there's still plenty left.
So go through it.
No disaster, no nothing. Like it was still there. So, but they were fine.
Yeah.
Did they go through your 16 pounds?
Pardon?
Did they go through your 16 pounds of sugar?
Well, one hive did most of it, and one hive didn't do very much of it. It all depends on what they need.
The one last that I'd recommend if you want to purchase something, because just as an FYI, making fondant or sugar brick takes kitchen time, takes a lot of sugar. You can go to places like Better Bee or Danant or anything else. They do have winter feed patties. It's going to follow pretty much what we're talking about. It's just this 1 pound slab of sugary food that you can You pretty much come to the top, you layer on. It never hurts to have those on hand if you have a hive that you're like, you get to January and you realize it's way underweight and you don't have time to make any feed. Having a couple patties on hand is a great option to be able to just quickly throw food on, let them go. Again, all of this I think plays really well into our Arkansas winters because, again, I'm sure everybody's run into it, but think ahead. We tend to, is it in January, February, where we get that 1 week of Arctic cold? Most of the feeding that I plan to has a lot to do with making sure when that comes, there's still honey in the hive because they're going to have brood at that point. So most people think of emergency feeding as I have no more honey in the box and they'll die. I've kind of, in my experience, and I'm interested in anybody else's, but it's more leading up to that late cold spell we get. I want to give them feed through the year just so they don't clean out all of their honey, because otherwise they're going to get babies, they're going to lock to where those are, and they're not going to be able to reach up and get any additional feed. Go ahead.
Wanted to add to that. I don't know if it's sugar patties or pollen patties John Price bought, and he was thinking about it, but he bought he thought he was buying like a whole bunch of little ones, but he bought like a 10 or 20 pound, and it was just a giant block. So he said, I would double check if you could buy like small little patties.
Yeah.
He's like cutting them.
This is why I miss John. He has the best lessons. 2 things. Buy the single patties, then they'll call them out. Don't buy a 20-pound thing and have to cut them yourself because it's messy. And it's important to know there's pollen patties and there are winter patties. Most of the time they will not sell winter patties until it gets to be colder like it is. And the main difference is the pollen patties are the worst thing you could throw on because they have a pollen count, and kind of their design is to help brood production, which is not exactly what you're shooting for in the December time frame. It can really mess up your bees if you were to give them something that's stimulating growth right before a cold spell. Make sure that you look for not a 20-pound block, but smaller. Usually, I think it's like a 1 to 3 pound flat, and make sure that it's a winter patty, and it'll call out that, hey, we got to go. This is an emergency food.
Double check the ingredients.
Yeah.
We bought some this year recently. Winter patties, and they're pollen patties when you get them in.
And that's,
check the ingredients before you order them because
they
just call it
whatever they want.
call it
And
whatever they want when you get it. It's a pollen patty.
where did you order that from?
Amazon.
Oh, yeah, I could see that. I would recommend looking at. I've had some really mixed results in what I get from Amazon when it comes to bee equipment. Some's been great. Some's a little dodgy.
Better be look like they have one out of sugar.
Yeah, Dannon, Better Be, Man Lake, those are pretty good, reputable places. They would recommend right now that if you wanted some, you'd order them. They're not cheap. If you think you've got your feed covered, don't worry about it. But if you just want something I can pull out of the fridge and throw right on because I need it now, it's not a bad option.
Central Beekeepers at Russellville
Yeah.
is a good place.
I hate to say this. I have not been down to Russell's to see that. You could go drive there today and get the patties, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that may be a good thing just to, unfortunately, we don't have a beekeeping supply company in the traditional sense in the Washington and Benton County area. But if you want to get some winter patties and save on shipping, maybe you're going down to Russellville anyway. He'll ship.
You
Perfect.
have to be careful about these pollen patties because the hive beetles love it.
Oh yeah. Ooh, I stopped using them because in the spring that'd be great. and then whatever hive beetles made it through the winter would move up, and they couldn't stay on for more than a couple days before they turned into a mess. And I definitely would not want to do that over the winter because, yeah, the hive beetles were rough this year for me. I think I got some of them, but I know I've still got some crawling around. I just can't get rid of them at this point.
I didn't have hive beetles. I put a little sign up in front of my hive that said no hive beetles allowed.
No hive beetles allowed. I like that. I should have tried that. Yeah.
Fondant,
Yes.
cake fondant.
So
Close, or is it don't use?
what I've heard, and I would always encourage checking with anybody who's in the club who's used it or online. I have heard that Hobby Lobby has a fondant that is appropriate for bees. And again, fundamentally, fondant is just sugar. It's just really sticky, stretchy sugar substance. I know John has talked about Hobby Lobby in particular. Google what you've got to see if there's any reference. I've heard generally there are different types, but most of it is good for bees. I tend to make a version of fondant. You can make it at home. It takes me about 3 to 4 hours to make a big batch. It's really time consuming for me.
No, I haven't used it. But I have some.
It's kind of time consuming because you have to cook it.
Uh-huh. You have to cook it, and then so has everybody made fondant? Do you know what we're talking about by making fondant?
I don't think I know what fondant is.
Don't know what fondant is?
I mean, yeah.
Fantastic. The way that I make it is a ratio of sugar and water, and I add a little vinegar because the recipe tells me to. And you take it to, I think it's like 234 degrees, and you hold it there for about 15 minutes. And this is one of those, if you've ever seen somebody make like hard candy or something like that, it's playing with that. You're taking the sugar to a temperature where you're starting to change its structure, and you hold it there, and you get this super syrupy thing. By the way, have headroom because mine always likes to bubble. Do it in a bigger pot than you're cooking it. And then what happens is you let it cool, and as you cool it, you start stirring it. And what will happen is once it hits about 120 degrees, you're going to start having sugar start sticking to itself. And so you're going to take it from this real golden amber color to it starts to turn white. And when you pour it, again, I got little soap molds that I pour it into so I can have these small bricks. It will cool, and then it will be a solid but moist brick of sugar. And that kind of sugar is something bees can just straight eat. Dry sugar they can't just take. But because you've heated this, and this is similar to candy board. Candy board's drier, I believe.
It's very same procedure
Yeah.
as what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Same procedure. It's laborious.
It's a laborious process.
But I've been doing it for a number of years, and I've always had success. It's always got my bees through the winter.
Yeah, and
it's like rock candy almost. It's a solid block.
mine's a little softer, and it's probably the ratio of sugar to the water, but it's the same concept of cooking a sugar to make it a thing that the bees can eat, but that it's solid. And the idea behind that is, and again, this is one that I really have enjoyed. And again, I'm just talking about this to see what everybody does, because people talk about it really big for like cold states. I'm starting to come to a firm believer of winter feeding because it's so warm. There's no food. You're giving them food that they can get into that is not honey. But we can get you a recipe. In fact, if I can get your email, I'll send you mine, and maybe we can share around. It's time intensive. It's a little sticky. I tend to do 2 batches in the season. One for, I tend to put my first food on mid to late December because, at the moment they're still flying around. I want them to get some level of honey eaten, but come mid-December, I tend to feel where everybody's at. Again, feeling where they're at is a huge thing. If they're super heavy, maybe you want them to eat some of that down so you're not dealing with being honey bound in the spring. But if you start to feel them getting lighter or they feel just like everybody else, you can make these batches of however mold you want, fondant, candy board, it's just the dryness. And then you kind of work on putting it on top. And it's just that food on top of their head that they can get to if it gets really cold. If it's warm and there's just nothing to eat, they'll, in my experience, eat the fondant before they go to the built-in honey. Like they just, on those warm days, I take a look in and they're just all over it, going to town. And it helps ensure that the bees have something to do besides just eat into their reserves.
Do you prefer the fondant over a candy board then?
I haven't done the candy board because I have I promised my wife that I would never have more than 5 hives. So I think I was at 13 this year. I've got a little too much equipment. And so for me, I like the idea of the candy boards, but it's another equipment because you pour it into, and correct me if I'm wrong, you pour it into a board that then goes on top of the hive.
Is this Dave? I'm sorry, your name, I've known you for a long time. Dave? Yeah, Dave.
Dave.
That's what Dave is talking about.
Yeah. Well, he's asking.
His inner cover board.
Yeah, he's asking about fondant versus candy board. I haven't done candy board because for me, it's new equipment, and I just don't have space for it. And put it on top.
Yeah, I make a bunch of them, and then I put the extra ones in the freezer because in the springtime, before the flowers are coming in,
It's same deal.
Most of the time, I'll replenish and put another one in there to get them in there and fill the
Yep.
flowers.
He touched on one thing that I'll remind. If you use a feed that requires a space, in absence of food, bees won't make burr comb. That's not what they're focused on. Once they start getting food and have kind of new brood going, they get the wax production going. I had one hive that when I did the check at the end of January to see if they had needed more feed or not, I opened that inner cover and it was wall-to-wall comb that they filled it with honey they capped. I have no idea what that hive did, but it sort of speaks to, even when you think there's no food, they found it. Doing this winter feeding with a space, doing a fondant, the way I do it, has worked really well. I have to get rid of that space before they start deciding they need to make comb, because otherwise you just get the biggest mess. It's the worst inspection, that first one when you pop it off and you got to get rid of all the burr comb. It's a double-edged sword, and that may be a thing that the candy board solves, because it's not so much of a space that you might do if you were doing a fondant brick or something like that. And it sounds like you've got a couple people who make it all the time and could give you some tips. But
We've made it a number of years.
Okay.
But I was just wondering about fondant.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a soft and it's a brick that goes on top that
Does it have to be a brick? Can you roll it out so it's flatter?
I do it as a brick just because then I can stack it well. You probably could make any size you want. That's really your creative in space. I like the fondant because it's easier for them. Since it's such a soft sugar, they really go after it. Whereas I've made harder stuff that's probably closer to a candy board, and they tend to need more moisture than some of my hives get, and so I'll find those just kind of abandoned. But again, that's my experience where the fondant has been easy. And even my kids, like, it's so soft you can just start biting into it. So my kids, if I ever make it, they try to steal little pieces. And that's part of the fun is it's light, it's already moist. It will not help deal with your moisture problem because it's not really going to absorb much, but it is very ready for your bees to eat.
Where do you get your molds that you make it?
I got if you do like a search for like silicone soap molds or anything like that, and I mean I've got ones that are this big. I bought a few that are bigger than this, and I use them. I use it for my fondant and I use it for my wax. I'll pour the stuff in, let it cool, pops right out. Silicone is great because it really nothing sticks, so I can double purpose it on both of those. So.
I have probably kind of where that's something.
Yeah.
Like once it sets, it pops out.
Yeah, I just like the small size because it stacks really well. But yeah, anything that you can pour into a mold and pop out works really well. You can use wax paper to help make sure you get it all out. The biggest difference between fondant and candy board is the softness, from my experience. And again, you can go buy fondant ready to go. Double check, there's a lot of articles that will tell you the pros and cons of fondant and which ones you can buy, but it's readily available.
Candy thermometer.
Yes, sir.
But other than that, you just need sugar.
Which is not,
Water to vinegar.
yeah, John was pointing out, and I don't know if anybody's looked at it, sugar is not cheap these days. I recommend taking a look at any of your Sam's Club or keep an eye on those big bags and see if you can get it cheap, because I think the last ones I bought were like $16, $17 for a 10-pound bag. And
Sam's has 25 pound bags for $16.
yeah, 25 then, yeah. You can get more expensive if you just walk into a Walmart. It's important to have. And again, as you go through the next couple months, what I would recommend is keeping an eye on those bees. You don't have to inspect them or all of that, but just heft them. Keep an eye on the weight. The biggest concern that I've seen, and particularly have been thinking about with this weather, is it's so warm. And if we keep that up, once at some point the flowers have to go away. The bees are big and they're going to be flying around. They're going to go through that honey way faster than you're going to read about online, because most of those getting bees through winter are geared for Maine and Pennsylvania, cold places that is actually if it's 40 degrees in the hive or 40 degrees, they tend to be the best in terms of honey use. Once you get higher, they fly around too much and it gets too much colder. They'll burn through it. 40 is the best. And I mean, we tend to be in the 50s and 60s even in December.
Another way you can feed is sugar water in freezer bags.
Tell me more. I've not had
I
that.
make a gallon of sugar water, and I put it in a 2-gallon freezer bag,
Yeah.
and it just fits on top of the frame, and you have just a little edge around all the way around. I take my box knife and just when you lay it on there, there'll be an air bubble.
Yeah.
Just make 2 little slits in that air bubble, and that sugar water won't run out. The bees come up in there and suck every bit of that.
Can you do that in December and January, or is it too cold in that?
Well, I've never had any freeze, but I've never used it in January, February.
Yeah.
I just used it in the fall.
But you don't freeze it, you just actually liquid.
Yeah, it's liquid, yeah, it's regular sugar water. And they'll just suck every bit of that out of that freezer bag.
Yeah. Yeah, again, mason jars is what I use because I've got them for the honey anyway. They're cheap, they're easy. If something happens to them, I'm out $2. It's not too bad. But yeah, if you have any light hives, man, I would be leaning into the simple syrup. I can't imagine we don't, in the next couple weeks, if that's going to have to come to an end, doing the fondant, doing a sugar board, mountain sugar is a great way if you're worried about moisture. But it's probably now is a really good time to think ahead. Get your sugar. If you've got a long weekend, you've got some spare time, making some candy boards, making some fondant, thinking ahead of what happens in December or January. that'll help get your bees in, and hopefully we'll be meeting again in February to talk about, oh my God, I got these bees through winter and they're doing great. What do I do now? So that is what I've got. I know John does it different, but I always like to ask, does anybody have any bee problems or questions, or even something interesting going on you want to talk about on what's going on in your apiary right now? I see some smiles.
I think we've covered it all. It's pretty much
Covered it all?
Trying to keep them alive. You mentioned the burr comb thing.
Yep.
That happens to be the last month. They went from not producing anything to transition to bees when you get ready. And they really they hung the burr comb off my top board and filled it full of honey in like a month and a half.
Wow.
Yeah, they'll be fine. They're annoying to deal with, right?
You're making me worried. I put the spacers on early so they had a chance to put the propolis in. I only had one that was just hell-bent on putting honey up when there was nothing going on. But anyway, I think that is what I've got. So I think we have one order of business from Miss Phyllis over there.